In this video, we'll look at life under slavery. Plantation slavery. In society's basement in the South of 1860, nearly 4 million black human chattels. Their numbers had quadrupled since the dawn of the century, as the booming cotton economy created a seemingly unquenchable demand for slave labor. Legal importation of African slaves into America ended in 1808, when Congress outlawed slave imports, but the price of black ivory was so high in the years before the Civil War that uncounted thousands of blacks were smuggled into the South. Despite the death penalty for slavers, only one slave trader was ever executed, N.P. Gordon, whose death took place in New York in 1862 during the second year of the Civil War. The huge bulk of the increase in the slave population came not from imports, but instead from natural reproduction, a fact that distinguished slavery in America from other New World societies and implied much about the tenure of the slave regime. Above all, the planters regarded the slaves as investments, into which they had sunk nearly $2 billion of their capital by 1860. Slaves were the primary form of wealth in the South, and they were cared for as any asset is cared for by a prudent capitalist. Accordingly, there was sometimes spared dangerous work, and if a neck was going to be broken, the master preferred it to be that of a wage-earning Irish laborer rather than that of a prime field hand, worth $1,800 by 1860. Tunnel blasting and swamp draining were often consigned to gangs of expendable Irishmen, because those perilous tasks were death on blacks and mules. Slavery was profitable for the great planters, though it hobbled economic development of the region as a whole. The profits of the cotton boom sucked ever more slaves from the upper into the lower South. By 1860, deep South states of South Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana each had a majority of blacks and accounted for half of all of the slaves in the South. Breeding slaves in a way that cattle are bred was not openly encouraged, but thousands of blacks from the soil-exhausted slave states of the Old South were sold down the river to toil as field gang laborers on the cotton frontier. Women who bore 10-plus babies were prized as rattling good breeders, and some of these females were promised their freedom when they had produced 10 children. White masters all too frequently would force their attentions on female slaves, fathering a sizable mulatto population, most of which remained enchained. Slave auctions were brutal sights. The open selling of slaves under hammer was one of the most revolting aspects of slavery. On the auction block, families were separated with frequency, usually for economic reasons, such as bankruptcy or division of property. Abolitionists decried the practice, and Harriet Beecher Stowe seized on the emotional power of this theme by putting it at the heart of the plot of Uncle Tom's Cabin. White Southerners often romanticized about the happy life of their singing, dancing, banjo strumming, joyful darkies, but conditions carried greatly from region to region, from large plantation to large farm, and from master to master in the South. Everywhere slavery meant hard work, ignorance, and oppression. The slaves usually toiled from dawn to dusk in the fields, under the watchful eyes and ready whip of hand of a white overseer or black driver. They had no civil or political rights. They had only minimal protection from arbitrary murder or unusually cruel punishment. Some states banned the sale of a child under the age of 10 from its mother, but all such laws were difficult to enforce, since slaves were forbidden to testify in court or even to have their marriages legally recognized. Floggings were common, for the whip was the substitute for the wage incentive system, and the most visible symbol of the planter's mastery. Strong-willed slaves were sometimes sent to breakers, whose technique consisted in lavish laying on the lash. But savage beatings made sullen laborers, and lash marks hurt resale values. The typical planter had too much of his own prosperity riding on the backs of his slaves to beat them. By 1860, most slaves were concentrated in the Black Belt of the Deep South that stretched from South Carolina and Georgia into the new Southwest states of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. This was the region of the southern frontier, into which the explosively growing Cotton Kingdom had burst in a few short decades. As on all frontiers, life was often rough and raw in general, and the lot of the slave was harder than it was in other areas. The majority of blacks lived on larger plantations that harbored communities of 20 or more slaves. In some countries or counties of the Deep South, especially along the lower Mississippi River, blacks accounted for more than 75% of the population. There, the family life of slaves tended to be relatively stable, and a distinct African American slave culture developed. Forced separation of families were evidently more common on smaller plantations and in the Upper South. With impressive resilience, blacks managed to sustain family life in slavery, and most slaves were raised in stable two-parent households. The continuity of the family identity was evident. African Americans also displayed African cultural roots when they avoided marriage between first cousins, in contrast to the frequent intermarriage of the planter aristocracy. African roots were also visible in the slaves' religious practices. Though heavily Christianized by the itinerant evangelists of the Second Great Awakening, blacks in slavery molded their own distinctive religious forms from a mixture of Christian and African elements. African practices also persisted in the responsorial style of preaching, in which the congregation punctuates the minister's remarks with assents and amens. Slavery was intolerably degrading to the victims. They were deprived of the dignity and sense of responsibility that comes from independence and the right to make their own choices. They were denied an education because reading brought ideas, which brought discontent. Many states passed laws forbidding their instruction, and about 90% of adult slaves at the beginning of the Civil War were totally illiterate. For all slaves, virtually all blacks, the American dream of bettering one's lot through study and hard work was a cruel and empty mockery. Slaves often slowed the pace of their work by laboring to the barest minimum that would spare them the lash, thus fostering the myth of black laziness in the minds of whites. They filched food from the big house and pilfered other goods that had been produced or purchased. Slaves sabotaged expensive equipment, stopping the work routine altogether until repairs were accomplished. Occasionally, they even poisoned the master's food. The slaves also universally pined for freedom. Many took to their heels as runaways, frequently in search of separated family members. Others rebelled, but not so successfully. In 1800, an armed insurrection led by a slave named Gabriel in Richmond, Virginia, was foiled by informers, and its leaders were hanged. Another slave rebellion leader, Denmark Vesey, who was a free black, led an ill-fated rebellion in Charleston in 1822 and was hanged with his followers. Again, in 1831, the semi-illiterate Nat Turner, a visionary black preacher, led an uprising that slaughtered about 60 Virginians, mostly women and children, and the reprisals were swift. The taint of slavery also left its mark on the whites. It fostered the brutality of the whip, the bloodhound, and the branding iron. White Southerners increasingly lived in a state of imagined siege, surrounded by potentially rebellious blacks inflamed by abolitionist propaganda from the North. Fears bolstered a theory of biological racial superiority. The South was turned into a reactionary backwater in an era of progress. One of the last bastions of slavery were forced to degrade themselves along with their victims. And we'll discuss different slave rebellions and their impact on the culture of the South and the white plantation owners more in class. In this video,